Hello and welcome to Forward. Our guest today is Mike Elashoff, the co-founder and CEO of Cornerstone AI. Cornerstone's goal is to give everyone the data science superpower of clean data without the manual work it takes to get there. They are focused on empowering the healthcare industry by using machine learning to convert raw data into analysis-ready data. The vast majority of healthcare data is either human-generated or human-entered and prone to errors. Cornerstone's platform yields higher quality data than the manual approaches data science teams employ today, and it does so an order of magnitude faster, compressing months to days and days to hours or even seconds. Prior to founding Cornerstone with his co-founder Andrew Howland, Mike worked at several biotech companies and founded a machine learning startup called Patient Profiles that was acquired by Medidata. Mike was also a reviewer and a team leader at the FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. He received an undergraduate degree in statistics from the University of California at Berkeley and a Ph.D. in Biostatistics from the Harvard University School of Public Health. In this episode, we talk about the challenges healthcare organizations face managing their data, what new requirements to data are introduced by AI, how Cornerstone applies machine learning technologies to address these challenges, and best practices organizations can implement to improve data management. We also talk about their work on COVID-19, why off-the-shelf machine learning models do not work for them, how to put together a great founding team, and why self-reliance can be treacherous. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Let's start with a brief overview of the situation with the healthcare data. We've been accumulating this data for decades, but its quality is far from pristine. It has manual entry errors, is stored in disparate places, and so on. What is the impact of these data issues on healthcare companies?
So there are several converging trends. First, as you said, there's an explosion in the amount of healthcare data that's available. Second, there's an increasing use of what I'd call non-traditional, non-clinical trial data for medical science. And those are things like electronic medical records, claims data, digital health apps, patient-generated data. And those sources tend to have markedly lower data quality than clinical trials. Often, for example, medical records are still hand-entered and rarely checked for accuracy. And then the third trend is the emergence and ubiquity now of machine learning and AI methods that can draw insights from the data, but are particularly sensitive to those sorts of data problems that I just mentioned compared to standard statistical models. And so that those convergence of trends means that basically every healthcare company data that we interact with is struggling to kind of get the impact and insight from their own data that they'd like to see. They're spending a lot of money to acquire data, to generate it. They're hiring a lot of data scientists, but it remains a big problem. And there's some automation that's coming into the data cleaning process, but there's still a lot of manual work being done. In fact, the commonly cited statistic that pretty much every data scientist will tell you is they spend about 80% of their time on data prep and only 20% of their time on the analysis itself. And so obviously that means they're only sort of devoting 20% of the time to the actual business of those healthcare companies and those objectives, and spending an enormous amount of time just getting the data ready to start answering those questions.
Machine learning as a technology can be quite unforgiving when it comes to the data quality. And are these challenges universal for all types of healthcare organizations, or do different types have different pain points?
I think different organizations have different pain points within the broader context of the shared problem of data quality and standardization. For some, the problem is more integrating in multiple different sources into a combined data set and ensuring that the sum is greater than the parts. In other cases, it's a struggle with manual data entry errors and other individual data points that are just simply wrong. And then you magnify that by the total amount of data, and you get hundreds, thousands, millions of data points that potentially need to be corrected. In other cases, the problem is missing and incomplete data where you know it should be there, but it's not available in the medical record, and you have to infer what it should be. So while the problems may differ in their particulars from company to company, the overall pattern is pretty much the same. People struggling with incomplete and inaccurate data and trying to build, as you say, unforgiving machine learning models that require not just a few fields to be accurate, but basically the entire data set. And then having a challenge that those machine learning models aren't achieving the results they'd like to see, trying to say, how can they improve those models? And the number one answer tends to be they need to improve the data that goes into them.
And one thing is to improve the data when you initially train the models, but as important, it is to maintain the quality of data as you use those models in production. Let's talk about your approach to helping healthcare organizations manage their data.
Our approach has, instead of what's currently done now, which I said is often a fairly manual process, is to develop a series of novel machine learning and AI-based algorithms that can replace that manual work with a mostly automated approach. And so what that means is using the data itself to learn what the sort of correct patterns in the data are, identify when those patterns are being broken, and then suggest corrections or fixes to how those data points can then fit more in line with the values that they're supposed to be. So, for example, if a lab value is off by a factor of 1,000, it's commonly because the units it was recorded in were wrong, and identifying that then suggests the correction that the units can be fixed. But you also have to keep in mind in that particular example that someone's lab value can be extremely high based on an underlying disease they have or a new drug they've started on. And so not every unusual point is an error. And so sort of simple rules like, making an upper threshold that applies to all patients really doesn't work. So that's why we're applying the machine learning models directly to the problem of data quality itself and inferring based on all of the data that's available what each value should actually be. And then if it's quite different from what we expect it to be based on everything else we know about the data, then we can identify that as a potential problem. And that applies to not just lab values, but it applies to everything in the entire patient record, whether it's diagnoses or medications or demographics or sensor data. That whole set of data, all of it can kind of come together and do a set of really advanced internal consistency checks to make sure that each data point, each record is as accurate as possible.
There are several important capabilities of the Cornerstone platform, like processing sensor data, unstructured text, and stitching multiple sources. Walk us through this and other capabilities.
Sure. So the first step is the system does an AI-based scanning of all of the tables, all of the fields, all of the values across the whole data set to learn its structure and the relationships. So those include things like where the lab values are, which columns are units? Is it in a long, skinny format or a wide format? How do the tables link together with what IDs? How do the diagnoses match up to the medications in time? And there's hundreds of different ways that one data set can differ from another. And so this first step tries to understand all of those ways that make this particular data set unique, and then can then use that information to then link and harmonize that disparate data into a common unified structure, whether that source is clinical trials, medical records, etc. The second step after the AI-based structuring is a set of machine learning algorithms that examine the accuracy of every data point across all the patients and assess how does that data point fit with everything else that's known about that patient. So that patient's sort of whole time course, their whole longitudinal history. Second, how does that data point with everything that's known about the patterns across patients? So what diagnoses are associated with what medications? What patterns in the sensor data can be linked to what clinical outcomes? Then take the information within each patient, the information across each patient, and fit the multivariate machine learning models and identify where potential discrepancies are. So those discrepancies could be as simple as drug names that are misspelled. They can be things like units that are wrong. They can be things like patients that are misdiagnosed. The whole host of problems that we talked about at the beginning, applying the machine learning models to identify those problems and then suggest corrections based on what was learned. So in that final step, the user interface basically presents the results of those machine learning and AI models in a way that someone with domain expertise can very quickly and efficiently review the results and make a decision that, yes, in fact, the algorithm has not only found the underlying problems, but has suggested the right underlying solutions, and then get to the clean analysis data set. And in cases where the algorithm has found something unusual that's actually sort of clinically accurate, then that annotation can then feed back into the underlying algorithms and further optimize them for their clinical and data accuracy.
We look for outliers. We try to guess what those outliers should be. And then we ask humans to confirm or reverse back to what it was based on their understanding of the whole scope of underlying data.
Exactly.
You also talk about fixing biologically implosive data. Can you unpack what that is?
Yes, so that's data that sort of, because of the underlying values or patterns, really can't possibly be correct. So in certain cases, for example, certain lab values, there's the expression incompatible with life, a value so extreme that you couldn't have collected it from an actual living person. But those tend to be fairly extreme values. There's still a lot of underlying patient-to-patient biological heterogeneity that you have to account for. So it's rarely as simple as saying, you can't have a blood pressure of 400, for example. The reality is that individual patients may have blood pressure within a well-defined range, but there's lots of things that can happen to that patient over time that may change that. And so the models have to understand sort of what's normal variation and what is unusual variation that has an explanation, which is real data, and unusual data that has no explanation, which is a potential outlier.
Values incompatible with life. Okay. What is the ideal model of dealing with healthcare data? that you envision when building Cornerstone, and at which parts of that life cycle Cornerstone fits in?
Yeah, I think the ideal model is correcting the data and the problems as close to the source as possible. So that means working with the raw data, even though it can be not ideally structured, it can have lots of errors and inconsistencies in it. It's still, even though it's a harder problem, it's still better to clean and standardize it at that early stage before any downstream analysis is done. Because I think a common pattern that I've seen in the industry is people do a little bit of data cleaning or standardization. They jump into the analysis and then they see, oh, there's something unusual that came out of the analysis, some unusual finding, some models that look like they've found patterns that they shouldn't be. And then they realize, oh, that's not a new scientific discovery. It's just there were problems in the data. So then they go back and fix those particular problems. And then they restart the model. And then they find something new and interesting and then realize, oh, that's actually a different error. And that sort of cycle back and forth, it doesn't save any time to sort of only do the clean selected fields early on. It actually saves time to clean it all comprehensively at the beginning, and then all the downstream analyses can work on that same common, consistent set of data and sort of benefit from those data improvements. So I think that's kind of the ideal way in which the data cleaning process can kind of fit into the overall data pipeline and analysis process.
My understanding is that Cornerstone is a horizontal platform within healthcare. How do you think about your customer profile and use cases they should use the platform for?
Yeah, so I think we've seen the most traction in several parts of the industry so far. That's pharma, medical device, digital health, and genomic diagnostics. And so what unifies those companies together is they generate and in some cases acquire large amounts of data that's not only large numbers of patients, but tends to be very detailed information for each patient. So it's a very rich data set. And there's a lot of opportunities in that richness to find new things, but there's also a lot of opportunities for there to be inconsistencies and lack of standardization within that richness. And so we've seen, a real benefit of the Cornerstone algorithms and systems for leveraging that richness, not just for the sort of business problem that the companies are working on, but actually we can use that to find the underlying problems and inconsistencies and suggest fixes by using the fact that there's such a rich source of data that these companies have. And I think we've seen that applies across different disease areas. So, for example, we've worked with cancer data, with Alzheimer's, with COVID data, sickle cell disease, sort of spanning some fairly different disease areas and patient populations. But the underlying problems that exist in data kind of span those seemingly disparate types of patients, and the methodologies that we've developed really apply pretty much regardless of the underlying patient population.
That work on COVID you did, what was that project about?
So that was a data set or a study that was monitoring symptom scores and other patient-specific characteristics over time, both pre-COVID, during COVID, and after COVID, to try and understand how the COVID symptoms sort of spiked during the disease, but how long it took for them to resolve, and compare that, for example, to the flu and sort of understand, how long after the acute phase of the disease are people generally recovered. And so that incorporated symptoms, it incorporated patient activity trackers, as well as sort of clinical diagnoses on the patients. All those data sets sort of combined into one for the purposes of analysis.
Any important ways data issues manifested in those data sets?
I think one important thing was that patients would enter their symptoms, but the amount of heterogeneity and creativity, I suppose, in how people would describe their symptoms meant that to make any sense of it at all, you really had to structure it very carefully into a kind of a controlled vocabulary. So patients would write their symptoms out in sort of long form that may have multiple different individual symptoms. Sometimes they would say the symptoms that they didn't have. And then you had to also resolve inconsistencies in sort of what they reported and what was actually known about those patients from separate medical records, for example. So they may sort of have a medical record that says they had a COVID diagnosis, but they don't report it themselves, or vice versa. Resolving all of those discrepancies is kind of the grunt work of data science. All the stuff you have to do before you can then start looking at actually what you're interested in is, how do COVID patients behave over time?
Those 80% that go into data preparation.
Yes.
When you talk to machine learning practitioners, there are two types of 80% they often mention. One is 80% that goes into data preparation, and the other 80% that goes into infrastructure preparation to do machine learning. After you multiply those 80 by 80, you're actually left with something like 10% of your time on actual analysis, which is a little bit disheartening. Okay, let's talk about the data question in healthcare. It's quite a sensitive issue, driven by privacy on one hand and regulation on the other. Beyond those two, we have cybersecurity issues, bad actors stealing the data, and now data poisoning emerges as a new threat, targeting the integrity of machine learning models with the goal of damaging them and distorting the results they produce, which can be quite dangerous if these results are used in healthcare. How do you address the sensitivity of data in your products?
Yeah, it's an important question. And I think one of the key foundational premises of Cornerstone is we don't aggregate data, we don't sell data, and we don't sell any insights we derive from the data. Our goal is simply to make a customer's data better. And I think there's been a lot in the news recently about the challenges of companies sort of aggregating large amounts of patient data, often without those patients' explicit consent, and building entire businesses off that data and the insights they get. And I think that's made people in the industry very wary of sort of sharing their data with anyone. And so that wariness is something that we have to overcome. And I think the way we overcome it is by explicitly saying, we're just trying to make your data better. We're not trying to take it and do something else with it. I think to your other points, though, you need a real intense focus on the data security and privacy. So, for example, HIPAA compliance is incredibly important. And my background, I started my career at the FDA. So the regulatory use of data is very important to me. And I think we've tried to build that in Cornerstone.
What do you see healthcare companies misunderstand or underappreciate about leveraging their data? What are common mistakes and how they lead to bad outcomes for them, beyond what we discussed about going into too early into cycles of analysis before you actually clean the data? Are there any other important points there?
I'd say there's two common misunderstandings. The first is the idea that maybe data issues contribute some noise, but as long as you have a lot of data, you can still get the right conclusions that the models will figure it out. I think there's a lot of times people think that the power of machine learning and AI models is actually much greater than they actually are. And I can tell you sort of counterexamples in every company I've ever worked at where it didn't matter how much data we had, if there were underlying problems, it wasn't just sort of a noisy answer. We got the wrong answer. So a couple examples. I've seen a drug not being approved because adverse events were misclassified. Worked on a lung cancer diagnostic that actually failed validation because of the way that smoking status was measured, had data errors. It seems like a very small thing, but those things, if they're important in the underlying models, can have an enormous impact. And the machine learning models and AI models can sort of focus on the errors instead of on the underlying signal, often because those errors and outliers are so influential in those models. I've seen a drug toxicity model that had, apparently high accuracy, but it wasn't good at identifying drug toxicity. It was just good at identifying the day that the patient sample was run, because every day was different in the lab. And so all of those were things where the problems or models weren't just a little bit off from data problems, they were just wrong. And then I'd say the second misunderstanding is maybe the notion that the value in the data is sort of what you think in advance are the most important fields, the most important variables. And I think in certain situations that can be true, but I've seen in a lot of cases that the real value is in considering things that you didn't know were important. I mean, that's the real sort of new value that's created from scientific discovery. And maybe to give a tangible example of that, early in my career, I was doing an analysis for a new drug to figure out the factors that were leading to some patients responding or some patients not responding to that drug. And there was a lot of a priori hypotheses, whether it was demographic factors or biomarkers. But what we figured out after a lot of analysis was it turned out to be the time of day that you gave the first dose, when the prescription was filled and when the patient started taking it. And that was more important than all of the other factors that were a priori thought to be important. And so then where that leads to poor outcomes from that misunderstanding is sort of a focus on the making sure only the kind of things you think of in advance as important for your model are clean and standardized, and all of the other stuff isn't brought up to the same standards. And so then that sort of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that those other parts of the data can't actually help because you haven't put the time and attention to collecting and structuring them in the right way. And so I think that's an important goal that we have, to not just make the sort of a priori important parts of the data good, make the entire data set good, and let the downstream machine learning models figure out maybe what you didn't expect is the most important thing.
We often talk about bias in data, but this bias is a little bit different. It's not bias in the specific data set. It's bias of how you pre-select and clean and process the data sets you think are important versus those that you don't think are important. So it's a second type of bias there.
Right, yes.
When your customers start using Cornerstone, what kind of impact on their organizations do you see?
I guess I'll give you a couple examples. So the first was a clinical registry study. It had very complex data spread out over about 50 different tables. It was based on transcribed medical records. So there were a lot of not only entry errors, but in many cases, misunderstandings about what was supposed to be entered. And so this was a new kind of data for our customers. So they didn't have, a whole lot of pre-existing rules or procedures in place for how to clean it, how to find the problems. And so they had a data team working for months on that particular data set. And when we started working with them, they ran the data through our system. It ran completely through the whole algorithm step in about an hour. Then we spent a few days with them reviewing the results in the interface, looking at the problems, at the potential sort of source, underlying reasons for those problems and the suggested fixes. And they found a whole large set of really significant problems they didn't even know that they had. So those were things like medical centers mixing up the date of the patient visit with the date that they entered the data into the system. In retrospect, it sounds like a very simple thing, but it's often hard to find, though, even those simple problems in the whole universe of, all the different tables, all the different fields, all the different complexity. In some cases, the people they had preparing the data for the trial mixed up lab test names, that they misunderstood the difference between hemoglobin and hematocrit. There were units that were incorrect. There were, in some cases, values incompatible with life in that. And all of these things sound easy when someone or an algorithm such as Cornerstone points you to the problem. But when you're looking at an enormous amount of data, it's hard to really spot them for yourself. And so that's sort of the power of the machine learning approach, that it can look at everything and look at everything in a sophisticated way. So in that case, for that particular case study, we're certainly able to improve the data and then do it kind of much faster and more efficiently than the manual review. The second use case I'll mention was a medical device company. They had a very large amount of data, hundreds of millions of data points, but they only felt confident using a fairly small fraction of it because of various data issues. And the way they were using that data is to classify patients into certain clinically relevant categories. And they were able to classify just about 60% of their patients into those categories based on the limited amount of kind of clean data they had from this larger data set. So ran that through the algorithms, which highlighted inconsistencies such as some of the patients were actually misclassified in their database. In other cases, just a lot of data improvements on the time trends over time within each of the measures they were recording. And once those inconsistencies were fixed and resolved, they were able to correctly classify patients, not 60% of the time, but about 98% of the time. And so that was a very tangible example of the value of making the data better. Sometimes is not incremental improvements, it can be quite significant improvements. Because, for example, every misclassified patient that they had in their data was actively telling the models they were building the wrong answer. And so when the model's trained on the wrong answers, it's going to give you wrong answers. And so I think being able to resolve those can really make a big difference in the resulting accuracy and interpretation of the data.
When the 40% of your input data is wrong, it definitely will make the models very wrong. you achieved quite a significant level of improvement and accuracy and level accuracy. Is it typical? Should organizations expect that after applying Cornerstone, they can get to 98% quality level, or they should be expecting maybe some range of the outcomes?
I think I'll divide your question into two pieces. First, they can expect very high accuracy in their data. If that doesn't necessarily translate into accuracy in the models they build on their data, because, for example, they might not have collected enough, there might not be enough underlying real signal in their data to support highly accurate models. That's something that's obviously going to be different from data set to data set, from company to company. What we can ensure is that the models aren't failing for data quality reasons. They might be failing for other sort of clinical or biological reasons. But that's sort of, I guess, outside the scope of what we can do. We can just say we can achieve really high quality, really high accuracy on the data values themselves. But for example, early in my career, I worked on a project that was predicting coronary disease based on a blood test. And we were using genomic markers. Ultimately, there's an upper limit to how effective genomic markers can be in diagnosing coronary artery disease. We spent a lot of time at that point trying to get a perfectly clean, perfectly accurate data set, but it was never going to be 99%. There was a fundamental clinical limitation on how much information is in the blood that informs on coronary disease. So certainly wouldn't claim that every model after using data passed through Cornerstone has super high accuracy.
How long does it take to implement Cornerstone to see the first results? You mentioned an hour in the previous example. So how usually it is to get the first results in such short time frames? And then how long does it take to get maximum from the platform?
The first run of the algorithms generally measured in hours, depending on the size of the data, but always in the course of a single day. Our goal is for the algorithms to be hopefully really good, but they're never going to be perfect. So in that case, then there's some amount of time that users who are very familiar with their own data can review the results in the user interface and make any corrections. Those could be things like we put two tables together, but they shouldn't have been. They could be we standardized a field into a date in a particular format, and maybe that was off in several records. On the error detection side, the algorithms will build rules for every single field across the entire data set. In some cases, those rules might need to be adjusted. But our goal is for that first run to kind of get you 90% of the way there. There's then a period of time where the customers would work within the user interface, adjusting things that may be as small as a couple of days. It might be longer depending on the complexity of the data. And then their adjudications, their assessments of the results, then feedback into the algorithms. There's kind of a feedback loop that might be a couple cycles, but ultimately we'd hope that in pretty short order, they can get the results in good enough shape that they can then export the data out of the system and start using it. If that's the entirety of their data set, then they're done. In some cases, for some of our customers, they have that initial data set, but they get new data set. They get new patients every single day. In those cases, the models that are built and refined can then be used in a more automated way without kind of retraining the data each time. So an individual record comes in, an individual patient comes in through, in that case, the API. The results where the problems are, what the algorithm fixes are, and then go back to the customer and use that as part of their data pipeline in an ongoing basis.
How do you approach machine learning engineering in-house? Which components to build and which to get off the shelf?
So for the problem we're trying to solve, we generally have to develop new methods, new methodologies. We're trying to solve the problem that machine learning and AI models don't handle data errors and inconsistencies well from on our customer's point of view. So by definition, we're building machine learning models to work on that same data, but we have to work with it in its unclean, raw state. And so our models have to work in the presence of, in some cases, large amount of errors. They have to work in cases with missing data and other internal inconsistencies that the data might have. So while we do, in some cases, start with some off-the-shelf libraries from Python or R, in basically every case, we're extensively modifying them for our purposes to make them work well and be accurate in the presence of all of those data problems. And so that means basically the entire set of algorithms we have are custom and novel and don't exist in off-the-shelf libraries or packages.
What kind of challenges this approach introduces to your work? It's much easier for the companies that can rely on pre-trained models that has been created by other teams. And in this case, working from scratch is a much harder environment.
Well, if all of those libraries existed, then Cornerstone wouldn't exist. If it was a mostly solved problem, we wouldn't exist as a company. But you're right, it is a much harder challenge, but I think it is personally very exciting. I mean, like developing new approaches to solving an old problem and figuring out how to do that is, in some cases, the most interesting part of Cornerstone as a startup.
It is. And you are right in pointing out that this is the reason for the company to exist. And this is the source of the value you deliver to your customers. Let's talk now about the origins of the company. What became a trigger for you to start Cornerstone?
I think the first trigger has basically been my entire career. Every job I've had, every company I've been at has struggled with this data quality problem, this sort of 80% problem, which is frustrating in your first job when you're spending 80% of your time on that. I can tell you it's much more frustrating when you're 20 years into your career and you're still spending 80% of your time working on the same problem and not wanting to do that again, wanting to really try and solve this problem in a comprehensive, robust way. And so that being said, previously I had founded a company. It was called Patient Profiles. It led to a successful acquisition, but it was hard enough that I told myself, I'm never doing that again. I'm not starting another company. But this idea and the problem just kept sort of intruding not only in my work and the teams I was building, the companies I was at, but just in my thoughts, like, can there be an actual comprehensive solution to this problem? So I called a couple people, a former colleague of mine, Steve Goldberg. He was in corporate development at Medidata, the company that had acquired Patient Profiles. And he's seen a lot of the industry. And what he said is, this is a great idea, but if you wait a few years, there's going to be lots of companies doing it. Like, it's too important a problem. It's too big of a problem. So either do it now or just forget about it. And so from that, I decided, okay, I am going to step into the world of starting a company again. And then the next call I had was to Andrew Howland, who then became my co-founder. For him, it was the worst possible time to get a call like this. He had a steady job, one child, a second just coming. His wife was still in graduate school. And so a pitch of, would you like to work on a risky startup where there will be no money for some period of time, was initially not the right time for him. But actually over the next we talked every few days, and I think he went from thinking this is terrible timing to thinking this might just be the kind of thing he wanted to do and really work on an important problem in a very hands-on way. And so over that period of time, he decided he wanted to do it. And I think having a co-founder is, in my experience, incredibly important. And so we sort of made the decision to jump into this, and have now grown the company together.
Did it take some imagination to pursue Andrew on your side? I mean,
I think what he was struggling with is something that a lot of us struggle mid-career as we go from being individual contributors to being managers and moving into the executive level. For a lot of us, myself, Andrew included, we got into the field because we love working with data. We love analysis. We love building models. And over time, you start doing more of your time telling other people to do those sorts of things. And so I think he was at that point in his career where he was interested in getting a little bit back to his roots. I know I was for myself, and really building something from the ground up. And so we talked a lot about that. And I think that ultimately was a deciding factor for him. And then I think hopefully some amount of trust that I had done this once before and it turned out well. So there was at least a little bit of a track record there.
you're doing similar thing in a similar field. That definitely gives a bit of conviction that this will lead to good results. Talk about your work with Initiate.
Just a little background. So in doing first company patient profiles, it was fairly slow to be successful because it was entirely bootstrapped. At the time, we weren't able to get any investment. We actually used our daughter's college fund as the as the primary source of investment for patient profiles, which is not good advice. of That's not a path I would necessarily recommend, even though it happened to turn out well. And so for Cornerstone, really wanted to not only do things faster, but to enable that, really have the support and funding that would kind of accelerate that growth. So the two co-founders of Initiate, Rowan Chapman, Yana Dimkova. I knew Rowan previously from other work I had done. I really trusted her. And so Initiate, the timing worked out great because Initiate was just starting their incubator. And both Rowan, Yana, and the other person on the team, Jessica, had a deep experience in building early stage healthcare and tech companies. And early on, we were able to, by partnering with them, focus our internal work a lot on the product development, the algorithm development, which, as we talked about before, was, had to do a lot of that completely from scratch, and have Initiate handle a lot of the business aspects. So initial customer introductions, the sort of financial model, et cetera. And so I think that partnership worked out really well and let us go quite quickly over the short time we've been in existence.
When building your initial team, what kind of people did you look for?
I think one aspect of the initial team, so the first 7 members of the team were all people I had worked with before. And I think that's a really important part of the hiring process, particularly in startups, that first of all, I knew I could trust them. And second, hopefully they knew that they could trust me. And and then that meant we could go pretty quickly because there were some pre-existing working relationships and a lot of internal trust across the team that we didn't have to have a whole lot of meetings or coordination or planning. We kind of all were aligned on what the goals were. And with the early technical team, the data scientists and engineers, would all experience the problem that Cornerstone was trying to solve firsthand. When you're solving your own problem, it can really accelerate things. The second thing I'd say on the hiring is the importance of people who have strong opinions, are comfortable sharing those opinions, but where we can have those strong opinions in sort of an open and honest conversation that's collegial and not, a win-lose situation. Someone has the right answer, someone has the wrong one, but where there's a learning opportunity and a collaboration on both sides. Those strong opinions, I think, in startup like ours are so important because the ideas have to come from everyone and everyone has to feel comfortable expressing those opinions and then taking some leadership in implementing them. So that's been, I think, for me, a really key part of the hiring process and growing Cornerstone, to find people like that.
Having people on the team that trust each other and have this level of self security, that they're ready to share opinions and not to turn every discussion into competition of egos or ideas, is extremely critical.
I'll give you a couple sort of more recent examples because they stand out pretty clearly in my mind. First one, we had a customer pilot project, and that required some new development work. About a week into it, our head of data science at Cornerstone, Clara, she told me I needed to manage the project differently, otherwise it wasn't going to be successful. And I think that we have the trust with each other that can give candid feedback, that it's not an opportunity for criticism on either side. It's an opportunity for figuring out how to do things better. So it was a calm conversation, and we made the change. I took that advice to heart, and that customer, like that project, ended up being successful. That customer ultimately signed a long-term contract, and it might not have had that conversation not occurred. And the other example was just in our most recent hire. So we just hired a head of business development. His name is Mark. And in the interview process, we had folks do a practice customer pitch for Cornerstone. We gave them the slide deck. We said, we'll give you whatever information you need for that process that would help. Mark was not only the only candidate who changed the pitch, he redid every single slide, and asked him in the interview why he did that. He said, our pitch wasn't very good. He said it was misfocused. He thought it should have a different focus and structure. And I think that was probably hard for him to do in the course of an interview. But ultimately, it was that, I think, said to us, this is the right kind of person who has a perspective on how to do things and is comfortable sharing it. He said it in a very nice way, with a smile on his face, but that we've now sort of said, taken that advice to heart and saying, like, how can we leverage that to make our next customer pitches better? So could give a bunch of examples like that, but I think that those sort of people, that sort of culture is ultimately what we're trying to do.
It is a very risky behavior for a candidate to criticize the company approaches from the get-go. Lots of people would just go for, we'll gradually change it. We'll gradually show them that they're wrong versus going heads on into this. But kudos to him and to you all for seeing that this approach is ultimately a better approach because it cuts the time it takes to adjust. Another important thing here is that you managed to convince all those initial team members to join you who worked with you before. What is the recipe there? I think it's important for a lot of entrepreneurs, especially just starting the company, to understand that those connections to other people that they've built over time are an important asset, and it's possible to leverage that group to build your initial team.
Yeah, I think it is really important, and to realize that let's say, the convincing part of the process in asking someone to join, like the hard work occurred years before in how we worked together, how we collaborated, where there was not even a thought of a future startup or anything. And it takes just a focus on working with your colleagues throughout your career and treating them with respect and trying to advance as potentially a manager, a leader, advance their careers. And in some cases then that comes back to help in the context of a startup like Cornerstone, where we can then have a set of people come together and be excited to work on this hard problem together.
As an entrepreneur, you don't build products. You build a company that builds products. How do you think about this? What kind of people, processes, and culture are needed for Cornerstone to succeed?
Yeah, it's a question I love because I think we spend a lot of time thinking about that at Cornerstone while we're doing the all of the technical and business parts of building the company. The one key aspect of culture is what I talked about in the kind of people we're looking for, a culture of people who have strong opinions, trust others to share them in an open and candid way, and trust others to sort of give feedback themselves, and where that sort of partnership and mutual trust is kind of a central part of the culture. I think another part of the culture is, while we're working together and collaborating on things, that people still feel some level of ownership on the specific work that they're doing. And that ownership means solving problems in the way that they think they should be solved. So sort of when we're developing new methodology, in some cases, or in many cases, there's not a lot known about the best ways to build these sorts of machine learning models in the presence of so much missing, incomplete, or erroneous data. So letting people kind of explore different approaches, apply their data science creativity, and to sort of do the work, often to their own very high standards. So enabling that in the context of shared partnership and trust across people, I think that those are really key aspects of the culture that we're trying to build. And then the last part that dovetails with both of those is the importance of learning, whether that's learning new methods, whether that's learning a new way to work, whether that's learning how we should be, figuring out how we should be doing our team meetings. And I think particularly in data science and engineering, you're generally bad at something before you get good at it. And so having both people who are, that's exciting and not scary, and then a culture that encourages that and is not just having people do only what they've done successfully before, because then they don't grow, and then Cornerstone doesn't grow.
You founded 2 companies now. How did becoming a founder and CEO of a company change you personally?
I think I took some pride earlier in my career in being fairly self-reliant, but over time, and I think being a founder of 2 companies really accelerated that, become a lot more open to advice, mentorship, help, and recognizing kind of how valuable that is. And that I think self-reliance is useful, but in many ways incomplete. And so then in along with that, really putting a very strong focus myself and trying to be, just as generous with any help or mentorship that I can provide, and having that be a two-way street. I'd say that's been an evolution over time for me.
Self reliance initially can seem like a very good thing and actually a very high level of achievement if a person is self reliant. But then you start to realize that it is actually somewhat lazy approach because it's much more comfortable to stay self-reliant versus than to reach out for advice or bring right people to the team. All that requires much more effort than staying self-reliant. So overcoming that trap of self-reliability seems to be a big improvement.
Yep, that's very well said. Very well said.
You co-founded this company with Andrew, and 2 questions here. The first one, you said this was your second call. Why Andrew was on the other side, and how having a co-founder helps on the journey.
For some context, my first company, Patient Profiles, I also had a co-founder, and that co-founder was my wife. She's also a data scientist. And I think something we both got out of that was how much in the challenges of a startup company, having someone who can support you, as you say, in the ups and downs was invaluable. So I think in Andrew, I saw someone who was not only very, very good at what he did, great data scientist, and someone who also had a real understanding of the business parts of data science and industry, but also someone who could be a real partner, because I think I do see a lot of parallels between marriage and a co-founder relationship, and both require some sort of commitment. That commitment may be long term, and in both cases, you need a lot of open, honest communication to maintain that connection. And because there's certainly many challenges in both companies that happen along the way, and so you need, I think, that strong connection to help both of you see through the hard times and then enjoy the successes.
Shifting to the future now, what are your long-term goals for the company?
I think healthcare gets better by learning from data. That's the sort of premise of the healthcare industry at this point. And right now, that process of learning from data is, I'd say, inefficient at best, and sometimes outright wrong, because the underlying data just has a lot of problems. But a lot of those problems are fixable. And right now, people spend most of their time trying to fix those problems and less time on the more impactful problems of actually making healthcare better. And so I think if we can solve those data problems quickly, if we can solve those data problems accurately, we're going to have a very successful company. But I think what I'd hope to see for the data science field in healthcare and the industry overall is this enables the field to actually solve those more impactful healthcare problems and not be spending all this time resolving the same data problems that have existed for 20 years.
That's an exciting future to look forward to. For the last question, let's talk about the evolution of AI. What excites and concerns you most there?
I think one concern I have is that machine learning and AI software can make it really easy to do poor science and also to fool people into thinking that it's good science because they don't understand how it works. When you look at a simple model, and for example, that model reverses cause and effect, you can understand that that can't be correct. But that's often much harder to look at a really complex model and apply your intuition and knowledge to understand the potential problems that model has. And so I think that's something that the industry really needs to get better at. Some things I'm excited about. I think I'm excited about the role of AI in achieving equitable healthcare. And I mean, I've certainly seen sort of concern or news stories about, for example, let's say skin cancer detection and the AI models for that not having equal accuracy across patients and leading to bias. But I think in those cases, the problems are not necessarily with the AI models. The AI models are just holding a kind of mirror up to the underlying problems that exist in healthcare in those areas now, whether it's what data is collected or not collected, what patients are studied or not studied. And so I think rather than blame the AI model for being biased, it's actually the first step to understanding where that bias exists, and that the second step is then figuring out how to use that knowledge to fix the underlying problem. So I'm excited about that process. And maybe the final thing I'm excited about is that the machine learning AI approaches are really finding patterns and relationships that it's previously was really hard to find. And so I mentioned right at the beginning that analysis I did early in my career to try and find why some patients responded to a particular drug. And it took a lot of time and effort and maybe some serendipity to find that the time of day, which wasn't even recorded in the main analysis tables, was the key factor. But I think with machine learning AI techniques, there's the potential to find patterns like that without that serendipity and really learn those answers from the data. And I think that opens up a lot of potential that right now we're just at the beginning of.
I recently come across a quote by some scientist who compared machine learning to the telescope. He said, "We're now got this great tool, and now we can see things that were always there, but we just weren't able to see them."
Yeah. Yeah.
Mike, thank you for coming to the show.
Yeah, it was a great conversation. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening. You can learn more about Cornerstone by visiting their website. You can also contact Mike directly on LinkedIn to talk about Cornerstone, data science, or startups. The links will be in the show notes.